Hello, I will going to tell you some brief introduction about ISO IEC 27001. It's an international standard focused on security, and we will tell later on which part of the security. And it's suitable for any organization, regardless of its size or sector or where they make their business. And it uses risk-based approach. So it means that each implementation in every organization look a little bit different because of their different risk threats and different risk appetite. They have different levels of implementation of specific security controls. To notify the full name of the standard is ISO IEC 27001 from 2022, but in these presentations we will use the name ISO 27001 for the convenience. At the beginning, I will mention the certification process in brief, and then we will go deeper in these standards and following guidelines. When you want to be certified by this standard, first, you need to make this decision in your company to create project plan and define scope of your information security management system. Then you perform gap analysis of the current state of your organization and ISO 27001 requirements. In the next step, you should implement those missing requirements. And the optional step is internal audit or preliminary audit to evaluate status of your implementation of the standard, to have the possibility to correct some mistakes before the certification itself. And the certification process itself consists of the certification audit, which is divided into two phases: system analysis or design review, where auditor evaluate your documentation if it is compliant with ISO 27000 evaluation, where auditor evaluate or check if those documented controls are also correctly implemented in your system, in your organization. And based on those results, you will get your certificate. But this is just the beginning, because ISO 27001 has continuous compliance, and that means that you should perform internal audits and undergo surveillance audits. The first surveillance audit is 1 year after the certification audit, and the second one is a year after. The last step in the loop is a recertification audit, which occurs in the third year. And then, year after the recertification audit, you will again have to undergo the first surveillance audit and so on. So this is the certification process very briefly mentioned. And now we are going to talk more about this standard and the guidelines. Currently, we have two valid versions of this standard from 2013 and from 2022. The title of the first version is Information Technology Security Techniques, Information Security Management System and Requirements. Why I am mentioning the title? Because this is a little bit old. It's more than 11 years old standard. And there were some drifts and new trends in security. And those trends are reflected in the newer version of standard. There were some changes, adding new controls, modifying older ones, deleting some of the controls, and so on. But those drifts are now visible also in the title. And the current title is Information Security, Cybersecurity, Privacy Protection, Information Security Management Systems Requirements. So you can see that ISO is now a little bit more universal, because you can handle your information security, cybersecurity, and privacy protection via one standard. This standard consists of 93 security controls, which are mentioned in Annex A of this standard. And it provides simplification of your risk management, because you need only one register of controls for information security, cybersecurity, cloud security, and privacy. As I mentioned, this standard is a little bit more universal as the older version. Those 93 controls are separated into 4 domains: organizational, people, physical, and technical. Those are in the Annex A, and in the main body of the standards, there are other 26 requirements, But in this presentation, we will focus mostly on those 93 controls. If you Google ISO 27001, those articles usually are focused on those 93 controls. Usually some people tell that, yes, we have ISO 27000 certification, but there is no such thing. You can be certified only by standard ISO 27001. ISO 27000 is just a glossary, or you can use this term as a description or as the name of the whole family of standards and guidelines. The first very useful guideline is ISO 27002, which takes those 93 controls from the Annex A of ISO 27001 standard and explain them how you should implement those controls, some best practices, and the guidelines of how to do this. This is very useful technical norm. And another guideline is 27003, which can help you with implementation of those other requirements from the main body of ISO 27001. Then there is ISO 27004, which is focused on monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation of controls, because, as I mentioned, it's continuous compliance. So you should monitor and analyze data from your systems to evaluate the controls. And if needed, you should modify those controls to be still compliant with ISO and with your risk-based approach. Another very useful guideline is 27005, and if you are starting with some cybersecurity or with this standard, I recommend you with this guideline because it can help you with your managing information security risks, and it has a really good Annex A with a list of possible threats for any organization, and you can use it as the first step in identifying risk for your organization. Since especially ISO 27002 is technical norm, and if you implement those controls correctly, there is a high level of reusability of ISO 27001 controls. You can use the guidelines also for another, mostly for regulation, where the definition is too vague. For example, for NIS2 currently, and it can help you to be compliant with those standards, because if you are not sure how to do this guideline ISO 27002 can help you. And if you implement ISO 27001 controls in your organization, you can use those controls as baseline or inspiration for another standards, regulations, if you want to be compliant with something else. If you do this, you will basically face two situations. The first one is that another regulation or standard has a huge intersection with the ISO 27001, and you just implement the differences. For example, probably NIS2 will be really similar to ISO 27001, but you will have to implement risk incident reporting, because that's not mentioned directly in ISO 27001, but it's specifically mentioned with specific parameters in NIS2. And the case is that another regulation or standard is basically a subset of ISO 27001. So you don't need to do much work, but in all cases, you should be aware of that ISO 27001 gives you a lot of freedom, because all of the decisions should be made by you and by your risk-based approach. But those standards and the regulation can be more precise. For example, in PCI DSS, you should certificate your access privileges at least each 6 months. And for example, as I saw, NIS2 transposition into Czech legislation, they define the parameters of strong passwords. So you should always check those precise definitions if you are implementing another regulation or another standard. ISO 27002 introduces hashtags. It's a very useful feature and it's added to each control. And if you add to your statement of applicability level of maturity of those controls, you can create some great statistics which can help you create some prioritization in implementation of your ISO 27001. And here are the 5 categories: control type, information security properties, cybersecurity concepts, which are the same as in NIST cybersecurity framework. So identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Then operation capabilities and security domains. And since I mentioned the statement of applicability, it could look like this. First columns are identification of the control. Then in the status, we have the implementation status of this control in our organization with the maturity level. And in the last column, there are notes, preferably links to documents where you or an auditor could read more information about how this control is implemented in your organization. And if you fill this implementation status to all your controls, it can give you similar views, but this is for empty documents, so it's not very representative, but you can see how many controls are in the first phases and how many controls are in the highest level, for example, optimized. So you can create also similar statistics based on those cybersecurity concepts. So you can see that, for example, you are strong in detect, but you are weak in identify. So you can create some prioritization list of where to focus your attention in implementing ISO 27001. This is short introduction to this standard, and we are going to tell you about what we do with this standard and with MidPoint, or what can MidPoint do for you regarding this standard. We create a special statement of applicability. First, 3 columns are identification of the control. In the fourth one, there is the level of how MidPoint can help you in implementing this control. One disclaimer, there is not such tool in the world that can help you to be compliant with any standard just by the installation of this product. So if you have MidPoint, you are not automatically compliant with those controls. You need to configure MidPoint correctly to be compliant. So we have 4 levels of possible help, not applicable. So MidPoint currently can't help you with those controls. The marginal one, where MidPoint can provide you basic data for your decisions or for monitoring of those controls. Then the optional one, when MidPoint can provide more data and can offer some implementation, but you will be not able to implement all things that are required to be compliant with this control, but it can help you in some parts. And the necessary one is a level that nowadays basically you are not able to be compliant with those controls without a tool as a MidPoint or without similar tool with similar features. It will cost you huge amount of hours just to be compliant at the beginning, and then I'm not mentioning the continuous compliance process. So you need something similar as MidPoint. The last column is useful information for engineers. The column before is useful for the CISOs. And in the last column, you can see the list of features that are used from MidPoint and that can help you with compliance with those controls. Another point of view is when we have a list of MidPoint features. In the future, there will be more standards, but currently we are working with ISO 27001, but it's still a work in progress. In the next column, there is a list of controls with their identification. And in the last column, there is the number of controls where this feature is used. So you can see that some features are more universal, some are more specific that are used only in one control. So it depends, and it can also be useful for in your strategy. You can start with implementing a specific control, or you can start with implementing configuration of specific features. Depends on your preference. How it looks like in graphs, we can see that the midpoint can help you in 67 controls, at least at marginal level, but usually at optional or necessary one. And 17 controls are at the necessary level. If we break down this to those domains that I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, we can see that the midpoint is specifically weak in physical controls, but it's quite clear because midpoint is a software tool, so it can help you with building fences, monitoring via camera, screen desk policy, and so on. But also in this domain, it can help you with a few controls, and in rest of the domains, the midpoint is quite strong. And it's still a work in progress, so probably some controls from not applicable will be moved at least to the marginal one. This is all from my side, and Radovan will tell you more about our work with the standard and midpoint. Thank you for your attention.
In the second part of the presentation, we will have a look at MidPoint and how MidPoint can help you with ISO 27000 series compliance. First of all, I would like to reiterate on the thing that Peter said, and that's that no product can be ISO 27001 compliant, or no product can make you ISO 27001 compliant out of the box. Ultimately, the compliance is your responsibility, the responsibility of your organization. And even if you have a good product to support you, you have to set it up correctly to the state that your organization requires for compliance, and the specific configuration will be slightly different for different configurations. However, having said that, what we can help you is to guide you how to use MidPoint to make your ISO 27001 compliance easier. And well, there is the basic component of this is, of course, the MidPoint as a software package, as a tool. But there is much more to it than just MidPoint. There is this part that you need to use MidPoint correctly. And that needs a lot of documentation work and processes and the configurations and guidance. Therefore, what we are doing to help you is several things. First of all, there is a glossary in ISO 27000 document. We have integrated that glossary into our existing Evolveum glossary. So if you go there, you will see references to the ISO glossary. This is a little bit marginal thing, but the main thing is that we are working on documenting the ISO 27001 controls. And we are processing each one of these controls, and we are describing how MidPoint can help with these controls or cannot, as you have seen before. But we are describing how MidPoint relates to these controls, including the examples and configuration guidance and so on. We will see an example of that later. Then, as Peter shown you, we are working on Statement of Applicability spreadsheet. That is a summary of how MidPoint can help you with the compliance and which part of the compliance landscape can be addressed by MidPoint features and which are more to your processes and things like fences and armed guards. And last but not least, we are always improving MidPoint. So there will be in MidPoint 4.9 and subsequent releases, there will be new features and improvements. Some of them will be aimed specifically at compliance, either for ISO 27000 series or European NIS2 framework, or possibly other compliance frameworks. Now, let's have a look at closer at what we have to help you. For those of you that want to follow my examples here, you can use the URL shown on the slides, or just go to the Terios documentation site of Evolveum and just navigate to MidPoint, compliance, and ISO 27001. I will have some screenshots here, but they are probably too small to read. I want to give you some idea what documentation we are providing to help you. First of all, on the left side of the presentation, you can see a list of ISO 27001 controls. And for each of the control, we are documenting whether MidPoint can help you and how much MidPoint can help you, and what specific MidPoint features are there to address this control. So each ISO 27001 control has a detailed page, which can be seen on the right side of the slide. And this page describes in detail how MidPoint should be configured. First of all, what specific features are there, and then how they should be configured with examples. I would like to say here that this is still a work in progress. We are working on it. And although we processed quite a lot of ISO controls yet, we are not at the end yet. Let's have a look at how the ISO control documentation page looks like. It starts with the label and description. And the description of the control, and then there is the specification of the necessity of MidPoint, whether MidPoint is necessary to satisfy this control, or it is optional component or marginal, or it cannot help at all. Then probably the most important part for now is the implementation description. These parts are elaborating on the way how MidPoint features can help with satisfying the control, with some implementation notes detailing some stuff that may not be obvious at the first sight. And then there is documentation examples. This is a part that we are just working on, and it is not present in all the controls. And this part will provide better guidance on the configuration. And then there is a list of features, of MidPoint features that are related to these controls with clickable links that brings you to the documentation of the features. And the last is a list of related ISO controls, so you can navigate this documentation easier. This is an example of a documentation for one specific controls, which is information classification and clearances. This is one of the prominent controls, or this is one of the prominent features of MidPoint that is taking part of several ISO 27001 controls. Therefore, it is one of the first configuration examples how to use this feature. So if you look at this page, you will see a full description of the scenario with configuration examples. And these configuration examples are also provided in MidPoint samples project on GitHub with all this stuff like namespaces and complete configuration and so on. This is one of the first pretty much complete examples of how we plan to document your way to compliance. As I said, this is still work in progress. However, we have a plan how to proceed with the documentation of ISO compliance. The first thing to do is to finish the ISO 27 controls, the description. We plan to finish this summer. Then we will continually add configuration examples to these controls and describing several scenarios that are typical for ISO 27001 compliance. So there is one example of the information classification. There will be more. We will be adding that later this year and probably forever on as the landscape and MidPoint and the compliance requirements will be evolving. Then we will be focusing on compliance of ISO 27001's compliance of Evolveum as an organization. That is something that we are asking about sometimes, and we have decided to use our documentation on ourselves. So we will be one of the first test subjects actually to pass the compliance. And then we are already working on new features and improvements in MidPoint 4.9 and then MidPoint 4.10 and other MidPoint releases will follow. When it comes to MidPoint and new MidPoint versions, there are differences how you are supposed to address compliance with the different versions. There is MidPoint 4.8L long-term support version. This MidPoint version is designed to handle a vast majority of ISO 27001 controls. So in other words, you can be fully ISO 27000 compliant with help of MidPoint 4.A. However, it is what we call the baseline compliance. So the necessary features are there, but they may not be that convenient to use, especially if you are trying to use advanced use cases or advanced features. That is something that we plan to improve in MidPoint 4.9, where there are already some compliance improvements and more are being developed and some more are planned. So for MidPoint 4.9 and 4.10, the compliance should be easier, more comfortable, and faster. Some of the features should be pre-configured for compliance. So we are taking ISO 27000 as a guideline for default MidPoint configuration. It goes well with other compliance frameworks like NIS2 or of European Union or other requirements that are asking for software products to be secure by default and to have security embedded in the system design in the first place. So we are fully committed to do that in MidPoint. And then in the future, we are thinking about building tooling for compliance, something like checklists or dashboards that will show you whether your MidPoint is correctly configured for compliance. So that's the plan with MidPoint. To be a little bit more specific about the features that we already decided to implement, and some of them are implemented already. So for MidPoint 4.9, we are working hard on certification improvements. You will probably see that certification is one of the features that is taking place to address several ISO 27000 controls. That was one of the reasons to go for improvements. So we are working on that already. Then there will be a special type for policies. So policies will be a first-class citizen in MidPoint 4.9. You will see that policies are now represented as roles, which is a little bit confusing. So that will be fixed in MidPoint 4.9. And then if you have seen object marks for shadow objects in previous MidPoint versions, this concept will be used to all MidPoint objects, and it will replace policy situation used by policy rules. That is either MidPoint 4.9 or early in MidPoint 4.10 development cycle. Then we will be working on convenient way how to manage privileged access, most likely in MidPoint 4.10. And a much better user interface for policy rules. You will see a little bit later that policy rules are a prominent part of the whole identity governance business and compliance as well. We are already working on outlier detection functionality in MidPoint 4.9, and there will be also improvements to role mining in MidPoint 4.9 and 4.10, which will definitely help with compliance, especially the outlier detection part. And MidPoint 4.10 will focus more on advanced identity analytics with more reports, dashboards, and analysis of access rights and accesses as in general. Now, it was enough talking about slides. Let's have a look at something practical. So let's go for a demo. This is the familiar MidPoint user interface. However, it is configured for something that was that is not that usual now. What I would like to demonstrate here is the information classification feature. So let's have a look at classifications. Classifications are something like labels that you can attach to applications. This specific classification scheme with this category 1, category 2, and category 3 is based on Slovak transposition of European Union NIS directive. To little bit simplify the matter, I would describe that systems labeled as category 1 are systems that are classified for public access. So they usually contain public information only. Systems of category 2 are systems that are classified for internal access that may contain internal information internal for the organization. A system of category 3 are classified for restricted access. That means you need to pass some specific requirements inside your organization to get access to these. So this is a classification scheme. Now let's have a look at applications. I have several applications set up in my demo scenario. There are 4 applications, and you can see they are classified different categories based on the content of information stored in these applications. So for example, management information system is classified as category 2. What it means in MidPointish language is that classifications are pretty much meta rows. and they are assigned to the application. So if I look at the assignments, I can see category 2 here as a classification. I have created a little bit more convenient panel for this that shows only the classifications. So this is a management information system, which is internal information system classified as category 2. This is not, these classifications are not simple labels. They have a logic behind them. So now I'm looking at category 2 classification and the definition of the classification. And if I look at the inducement, I can see that there is a specific policy rule attached to these classifications. This policy rule states that any application that is classified as category 2 can be assigned to the user only if the user has NDA clearance. That means in normal language that the user have signed NDA and we have a record of that. If you look at this policy rule, it is pretty much standard policy rule that has a constraint. That means that this policy rule will be triggered when the user has no assignment of NDA. And when the policy rule is triggered, this means that the policy rule is enforced, which means that it denies the operation. Okay, I was talking about NDA clearance, but what is a clearance? Let's have a look. As we have classifications here, we have clearances as well. As classifications are labels attached to applications, clearances are something like a label attached to users. Clearances show that the user has passed some kind of criteria. Now I have two clearances defined. There is non-disclosure agreement clearance, which means that the user that holds this clearance have signed non-disclosure agreement. And I have a special cybersecurity training clearance, which says that user holding this clearance have passed through a special cybersecurity training. Let's see how it works. I have some very small user population here. I have few internal users like Emma, Petra, Simon, and Wendy. These are these users in blue. They are employees. And I have two external users, Charlie and Tom. Tom is a normal external user without anything special. Let's try to give Tom access to internal system. So I will try to assign collaboration platform user application role to Tom. That means we are now trying to give Tom access to internal user. Tom is an external user. So the policy, this is against all the policies. It should not work. And in fact, it does not work. The operations ends with an error that NDA is required. This is the policy rule that I have shown you in action. Now, let's have another try. We have a Charlie here. Charlie is an external user, but he has signed non-disclosure agreement. So as a demonstration of that, he has the NDA clearance. I will try to do the same operation with Charlie. Assign Charlie a collaboration platform user application role. And now it works. The policy rule checked the presence of the clearance and the assignment worked. What is interesting here is that this policy works even indirectly. If I let's get back to Tom. If I try to give Tom access to marketing analyst business role, which includes access to both category 1 and category 2 systems, the operation fails as well. So it is checked in depth. If I try to do the same with Charlie, that has the necessary clearance, then the operation is successful. Okay, now these were external users, but now we have employees. And we do not want all the employees to assign the NDA clearance manually. That will be a lot of work, and it will be pretty much non-systematic way, because employees usually have non-disclosure clause in their employment contract. Therefore, what we can do is to use an employee archetype, that is archetype that all the employees have, and we can place the clearance in the archetype, in the inducements. This means that for any employee, the NDA clearance is assumed. It is induced. So it is assumed that all the employees have this clearance. Therefore, let's have a look at Emma. She does not have any specific clearance. She is just an employee. And if I try, if I try to assign the collaboration platform user to Emma, the operation is successful because the clearance is assumed through the employee archetype. This, of course, works with the business role as well. Now, these are rules for category 2 system, systems containing internal information. But now, what about the category 3, the systems of restricted access? If I will go to the definition of classification for category 3 and have a look at the policy rule associated with this, you can see that this category is specified in a way that a special cybersecurity training is required for any user that is given access to the system. So let's go back and let's try once again to give Emma access to the research database, to the system that is a system of category 3. Once again, Emma is just ordinary employee with anything special. So if I try to do that, I get an error that a special cybersecurity training is required. This means that even if I make a mistake with role definition and assignment of a role, I cannot violate this policy. This is like another level of checking. Now, let's see Petra. Petra is a privileged user, and she has cybersecurity training as a clearance. So she have already passed the training, and she is well informed about how to deal with high security information. Let's try to the same operation here and give Emma access to the research database. And now the operation is successful. What is important here is that this framework of classifications and policy rules, it gives yet another layer of governance on top of normal policies. I will demonstrate that here. Let's have a look at this thing that we have here, this terrible role. This is a role that was very badly engineered. It gives access to all the systems in all the 3 categories to give access to pretty much anything in the organization. If I try to assign this role to ordinary employee, then obviously the operation fails, because in this case, Emma does not meet requirements for category 3 system. Therefore, even though the two assignments or two inducements of the role are legal. The assignment of the role as a wall is not legal in this case, then operation fails. It is even more prominent if I try to do it with Tom. Tom is an external employee without any privileges at all, and I now trying to assign him pretty much all the privileges in my system. A terrible mistake that I cannot do in this case because there are several constraints that I have violated. What is important to see here that I am logged in as an administrator, the all-powerful user that can do anything in MidPoint, except I still cannot violate the policy that I have set up for myself. This kind of policy guards me again making terrible mistakes, like using this terrible role definition. This is pretty much the basic concept of information classification. However, there is still one more thing to show. Some of you may have noticed that there is a special classification label, information classification, called privileged access. This label is meant to mark roles that have some kind of privileged access to the systems. If you are familiar with ISO 27001 or similar compliance frameworks, you probably know that the concept of privileged access is mentioned several times there. So let's there are few roles that are marked with this information classification, like, for example, website administrator. This role gives access to website, which is a category 1 system. It is a public system, but still it gives administration access. So it is marked as privileged access. So you can see that the information classifications, there can be several dimensions of information classifications working at the same time. Now, what is interesting about this privileged access is that we can use it to set up dashboards and reports. Now we have I have configured a special dashboard that shows that I have 2 users with privileged access out of 7 users total. And I can see which users are there, which users have privileged access. Similarly, I can see I have 2 roles with privileges that they are marked with privileged access. And you can also see that I have added to dashboards as like statistics for all the systems of all the categories, so I can see how many users are there. Okay, that's for the demo. Let's get back to the slides. Okay, now the key points, key takeaways from the demo. As you have seen, our concept of identity governance is all about the high-level policies. That's what we want to emphasize with MidPoint. The policies that are not about structuring the role and giving access and requesting the access that is approved and so on, but a high-level policies that work on a higher level than usual and that guards you against making terrible mistakes. The mechanism is based on policy rules, of course, and even the most powerful users cannot violate the policies themselves. Of course, if I'm an administrator, I can change the policies, but I have to do it deliberately. The policies, once in place, are guarding me from making unintentional mistakes. The policy rules set up this way can prove that the information policies are maintained. I have shown you how the policies are enforced, but the violations of the policy can be also reported and collected into dashboards and so on. So then can be used to show that there are no violation of the policies in the system. And MidPoint can track privileged access rights, which is pretty common mechanisms. And after all, information classification is a very, very powerful and flexible mechanism that takes place in several of ISO controls. Now, that is pretty much all from the workshop today. Just to summarize, you have seen ISO 27000 series is a series of international standards and guidelines. Even though the compliance with ISO 27000 series is not mandatory as per se. It is given by various legislation and indirect requirements, and it can be also a competitive advantage and so on. The ISO 27000 series documents are related to other compliance framework worldwide. What is nice from our point of view about ISO 27000 series is that it is quite technical. The requirements are specific enough for us to be able to process them and to form a guidance how to configure MidPoint to pass the compliance with ISO. As you probably seen that identity governance is necessary for ISO 27001 compliance at a scale. There are requirements that are too difficult to do manually for large user bases without an appropriate tool that can support identity governance. And I hope that we have demonstrated that MidPoint provides numerous features that can help you with the compliance. And it is not just MidPoint features that we are helping you with, but also the documentation and guidance that is documented on our documentation site. And last but not least, I would like to recommend you our upcoming webinar, which is a teaser for MidPoint deployment intermediate configuration training, which will be held on June the 20th. And that's all from me. Thank you.